Greetings! Welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel for our second video on pattern making for metal casting and our fourth video total in this skill building for sand casting of metals series. Okay, we're going to do 4 projects in making patterns, which each are going to add a little bit of complexity or an extra step involved. Okay. So the first was the simplest of all patterns, a flat back pattern, where you just put it on a board, pack sand in the drag, flip it over, and the cope is perfectly flat with sprue and gates and all of that. Okay? And this is a weight to be mounted to the bottom of some decoys that I carved. Okay? So that's video 1. This second video, we're going to make a swing weight. So swing weights are a style of, again, decoy weights, which swing, as the name implies, right? So this is a very simple round swing weight attached to this antique example, and it allows the decoy to bob up and down naturally this way, but anchors it side to side, so it looks more natural in the water. Also, because they swing, they will pack into a smaller space, like if you have a small boat that you're trying to get these things into. Now, this is a very simple one, but I want to make a nice curved one that will mesh a little bit better with the dimensions on the back of these flat bottom decoys. And in order to do this, I have made what's called a match plate. Now, a match plate is a pattern mounted to a board. Okay, so we have half the pattern on one side, and this is also the sprue attachment hole and gates are on that, and that will be in the cope side of the mold. And then on the drag side of the mold, we have the other half of the pattern. Okay, and they're indexed so that they're directly above each other. This is, again, an extra level of complexity over the simple flat back pattern because you're making a two-sided pattern. They have to match, they have to be indexed, and they have to stay indexed while something is in between them. Okay, so I will show you all of those steps. Now, if you're just jumping into this and you haven't seen any of the other videos, all of the fundamentals of understanding mold design, pattern design, and what works and doesn't work to just conceive of the pattern making process in general are in the previous videos. So I'll put a link up at the top of the screen to a playlist which contains all of this information. Okay? If you're watching this in real time, it's just the previous couple of videos. If you're watching this a year or two in the future, it'll be much easier just to pop in the playlist and search through the channel. Okay? So, I hope that you are indeed fascinated by how to index these on the Matchplate board, and if so, come join in. These flatback patterns are the simplest possible way to conceive of a pattern. Right? You need nothing else but to make it and then to pack some sand around it. But there's another sort of weight I want to make for the decoy. For some of these decoys, these flat bottom ones that I'm working on, I want to make a swing weight. So it'll mount here, and then the weight will swing back and sit. This is not on the frame? Is that on the frame now?
Yes.
Okay. So that it'll mount on a wire here and then swing back, and the majority of the weight will sit in this cutout in the tail area so that I can pack more in a smaller area, and they'll sit, you know, level-ish, right? They'll be offset by the thickness of a wire. But I want an asymmetrical pattern with an easy way to embed a wire in it. And for this, I'm going to make a 2-piece pattern. So again, I have 2 sizes of these. This is 5 inches wide. This is 4 inches wide. And to lay these out, I was using these stencils. So the outside is the 60-degree stencil, and then the inside is the 30-degree ellipse. Okay, in a couple different sizes. Do what you like, right? You get the idea. Do what you like. Get the drawing tools that you have, get the curves that you have, and just make something that you like. You don't have to make any particular thing, okay? But I want these to sit so that I have the majority of it on one side, and then just enough to bury the wire in on the other side. Okay, so it doesn't really matter here which ends up in the cope and which ends up in the drag, but I want to be able to cast this and then take the mold apart, carve out a little space in the thinner section which is 1/4 inch. This is 1/2 inch and 1/4 inch, so that the wire is embedded in the thin section, so that then this thicker section, let me pull the decoy out again, so then that thicker section sits in, behind the decoy like that. Okay? That's the objective. So, we're going to make a split pattern so that 1/2 ends in the cope and 1/2 ends up in the drag. To do that, we need to have these so that they match perfectly. We're going to have to cut everything out at the same time so that each one's going to be a little bit unique, right? These are handmade things. But we want them so that they meet up nice. And further, we're going to make a permanent match plate for this as we go along. Okay? So these are not only going to be separate from each other, but they're going to be separated by, one's going to be on the bottom of a match plate board, one's going to be on the top of a match plate board. Okay? That takes a little extra finagling. The first thing that we need to do is a way to join these that is strong enough while we are working to allow us to work, but weak enough that we can easily pull them apart. So I'm going to line the backs with painter's tape. Okay. And just allow that to wrap there a little bit. Give it a quick cut. There goes the excess. Okay. So this is on the back of the pattern with the tape sticky to the pattern. But I'm going to do the same thing. As I get stuff in the way because I'm trying to work quickly. Here. It's important that these edges line up very, very closely, but don't overlap. Okay. Now you say, how do you get them to hold together? Well, you need to do a couple things first. I want to transfer this line so that I have a basic idea what area I'm working with. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's right about at the gap. Okay, transfer this through. It's right about at the gap. And there. Okay. It's just going to save some materials. Okay? So the one pattern is, approximately there. The other pattern comes in an inch, is approximately there. So now I'm going to take some super glue and I'm going to put the super glue on the painter's tape. We want to make sure that it doesn't squeeze out anywhere that's not going to be covered, and this doesn't have to be perfect. Then we're going to line up edges of the other board. And super glue them together. Okay, so now we have them attached strong enough that I can work on this piece. But when I go to separate it, I'm going to be pulling the tape sticky off. I'm not going to be trying to bust a glue joint. Okay, so that's how we do our strong but temporary attachment. So the last thing that we need to get set up before we start actually cutting out our pieces is indexing. We're going to need to cut these apart, and we're going to need to attach them to that center board, and we're going to need to get them together in exactly the same position on opposite sides of a center board. That's tricky. So what we're going to do is we're going to drill a couple holes, and when we go to put this together, we're going to put toothpicks through these as indexing pins. Okay, so we'll attach one side to our match plate board. We will drill through the existing holes. Then we'll put toothpicks in, and then we'll put the other one, the back piece, onto the toothpicks, which are already sticking through the board. Okay? So it turns out a 3/32 inch drill bit exactly fits this particular toothpick that I have. Toothpicks may vary. Don't just take that as gospel. Okay? Now we're going to drill as vertically as possible some little indexing holes. I'm just going to do 3 through the big half and 2 through this little piece. And because those are haphazard, no two will ever be perfect, so that will keep us from putting the wrong piece on the wrong piece. We're also going to number them, right? We're going to be very systematic about this. Now, all of that is accomplished, and we're ready to start actually working on the mold pieces, the pattern pieces. So we've got all these cut out, the big ones and the little ones. I ended up doing this with a handsaw just by chopping down and then busting them out, that method. The bandsaw blade just doesn't want to stay on, and I just decided I didn't want to fight with it today. So, that's just fine. This vise is a little awkward, but doing this standing up is a lot easier with these little pieces. So we're just going to take the big old rasp and just waste that material. Okay? And this wastes really, really quickly. Okay? Don't think that you're at a deficit if you don't have a big bandsaw. You're not. I am using some of my folks' power tools, my family's power tools on this project, because it's letting me take scrap boards and plane them down to these thicknesses, the 1/2 and the 1/4 inch here. Okay? So we can very, very quickly just waste out the rest of that. And then just a 1/2 round rasp, just cut in the sides, okay, just like that. And I'm not going to go all the way there. And then if we turn it a little bit this way, again with the coarse side, very simple to carve that down. Okay. And again, since this doesn't have to fit with anything else in particular, it's its own thing. It's not like a component of an engine or anything. It just has to be nice in and of itself. Now, once we have wasted all of that material down to the line, then we need to come and we need to establish draft again. Okay? So, right here, grab a pencil. The green tape right there, I'm just going to mark it in with the pencil here so it's a little darker. Okay? I can see the green tape very easily with my eyeballs, but I want to make sure the camera can pick it up. That's our painter's tape and epoxy bond, right? So this is going to be the parting line of the piece, okay, where the two molds come apart. So this will be in one side, that'll be in the other side of the mold. I don't really care which is cope and which is drag for this. Now, since that is the parting line, everything needs to slope away from that line. So when I go to carve the draft and eventually round this all up, it's got to have that asymmetry in it, right? The parting line determines where you round to, where you cut the draft to. So to cut the draft in, I'm just going to come again with the big rasp and cut an even facet. Okay. Draft can't be too steep. It can be too shallow. Okay. So I'm just kind of, this is probably, what is this? 20 degrees maybe, give or take a degree or two. Doesn't have to be that. I'm going a little on the steep side because I know I'm going to curve it anyway, right? But I want to establish that facet, and then I'll do it on this side. Okay. I want to establish that facet before I start rounding things over. And that we will do the same. Let me just orient this a little better so you can see it. Here in the tip. Okay. Now on this we need to be a little bit careful because we have cross grain right here, right? The grain is going the length of the piece, so these little ends are very, very fragile, especially in pine. It's part of why I prefer to make patterns like this in hardwood, but this is going to be crazy reinforced till it's done. So it's not going to be a loose pattern. It's going to be crazy reinforced till it's done. So I'm not worried about this particular one being pine. And you know what? Even with professional pattern makers back in the day, a lot of pine patterns were made. So if you like pine, go for it. Why did I choose to use pine for this? Because I had some convenient scrap wood that was just the right size. Okay? So there, it's probably going to be a little bit too subtle to show up well. But let me just find something here. Yeah, I'll just use that. So this is against that facet.
I can't see it through your hand.
Can't see it through my hand? There you go. That's one facet. That's the other facet. Okay? So now those are established and they meet right at that tape line. And then to round it over is just simply a function of continuing that. Now, before I do all of this rounding, I want to carve all of those facets in so I can do it consistently. Right? So I'm not going to finish this piece on camera. I have this other one that has been all faceted and rounded, and that's what it's going to look like. Okay? So once you've worked all these over, once you've rounded it off, then we're going to take the sandpaper, which is hiding underneath the duck.
Don't you hate it when that happens?
Oh, I know. Yeah, don't you hate it when your duck hides your sandpaper? I don't know, there's always something sitting on your sandpaper.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
And then we want to sand this off all nice. Now, the sandpaper is your final carving tool. I've heard some carvers out there say, you should always get it perfect before you sand. Don't consider sandpaper a carving tool. And I call baloney on that. Sandpaper is absolutely a carving tool. Because it's soft. It's going to conform to your finger, and it's going to conform to the shape, and it's going to even up all of the facets and make them nice and pretty and perfect. Okay? So we want to get this nice and smooth before going on. And then this, in its final orientation, the wires will come out right where that tape is, so the lead favors one side over the other, and that will sit about up here on the decoy. Okay? And then when it floats in the water, it will swing down and sit underneath the decoy. Okay? So that's the idea. Now I'm going to go ahead and finish shaping all of these, and then we'll start taking them apart and we'll make a parting board. So, when we're going to actually make our match plate, we're ready to take these two patterns, and I'm just going to use the two of them for this first one here. These are going to get mounted to this piece of plywood. This is just a random scrap of plywood. This is totally a scrap wood project here. So these get permanently mounted to this plywood, one on each side, well, one half on each side, I should say, and that assembly becomes the match plate. The sand will be rammed down in while the flask is on top of it. It will be flipped as a unit, and then the other half of the pattern being up here, the other half of the flask goes on top and you ram sand from that direction. So the match plate holds everything in that orientation. So I've gone and traced a line around this flask box and marked in here, about where I want these two pieces to go. Because if you think about this, it's not just about having enough room for my patterns. We also have to have room for a sprue, okay? And there's going to be wires coming out of here so it can mount to the decoy itself. So I have to have room for that in this direction, okay? So all of that has to be true. And that's why I'm only going to put two in. Of course, I could put, I made myself 6 blanks. I don't know if I'm going to shape them all. But of course I could get all 6 of those in this box. But I wouldn't have room for all the other stuff if I did that. So that's why I'm only going to use 2. Now the first thing we need to do is separate these patterns. So I'm just going to take my knife here and very, very carefully start working it down in along that tape joint. Okay. So what I want is to just start cutting the tape free with this thin blade while simultaneously avoiding cutting my fingers off. Okay.
We're avoiding going to the hospital.
Yeah. You can see it's a little tricky to get apart. Just go careful, go slow. Don't rush any of this. But once we get in here, it's a little thicker. Put a little more force on it. Okay. So I've run that knife 3/4 of the way through. At this point I should be able to just start with a little pulling and sliding here. But we have to bear in mind there's cross grain there at that end. There we are. Okay. Now you get all this tape cleaned up. And there's our 2-part pattern. Okay. So before I do something dumb and forget, I'm going to write 1, 1, 2, and 2, so I know which one is which. Okay. And then this is going to get epoxied right on there. I'm going to set this aside for the time being. Okay. Now, I'm going to epoxy these in place off camera and get all of this tape and everything cleaned up off camera because that's just needless time. You see how it works. I'll finish it up here and come back when these are fully affixed and the epoxy is hardened. So we have epoxied both of these down. Um, the one of them did split right here, the one of those noses, while I was twisting the tape off. That's why I hate doing this sort of thing in pine. But as I said, it was convenient, and it is now epoxied to overkill plywood, right? This is 3/4 inch plywood. I would never choose to use this type of plywood if I was going to buy it for the project. But when I had this scrap sitting underneath the saw table, it was convenient. Okay, so with this much overkill, I'm not worried about that in the long run. I just put a drop of super glue on there to hold it temporarily, and now it is firmly glued to the plywood. So that's the only reason I'm using pine for this. Now, we need to take these, that's number 2, and that's number 1, and we need to get these glued in, matching underneath that. And that's where these little drill holes come in. Okay? So, the thing is, these need to be absolutely dead straight. Okay? Otherwise, if they go in at an angle, you'll end up with the bottom piece, instead of being directly over, it'll be offset a bit because the angle going through the 3/4 inch plywood. So, I am going to go and borrow the use of a drill press to make sure these are completely dead vertical. That's also why I'm gluing up the small side first rather than the thicker side. Because since I hand drilled these in the first instance, there's enough play that they're close enough to dead vertical that there won't be a problem. But these, some of them are pretty darn close, some are a little bit off. That won't be a problem at the end of the day, but that's why I'm gluing the small part first, okay? Because it's going to minimize any impact of that little bit of error. So I'm going to go do that, and then I'll bring the board back, and I'll show you what we're doing next. Okay, so all our alignment holes are in here, and I've inserted toothpicks and put a little drop of super glue at the end of each of those toothpicks. Sadly, I lost the footage of toothpicking the alignment holes, but, you know, I think you can use your imaginations that far. So, now, we need to get these in the right order, so this is why we label things, right? This is number 1, goes with that side. This is number 2, 2 and 2 goes with this side. So I'll set those off to either side. Now, when you look at this, sort of the horseshoe is pointing down, so I'm going to point them that way. The horseshoe is going to be pointing towards me in this orientation. We'll do a quick test fit. Yep. That one aligns. That one aligns. That's all good. Okay. I pre-squirted some epoxy. Keep getting dust on this from the workbench here. And then we're simply going to epoxy these in place. This is why we need those alignment pins to be pre-thought out. Because there is no possible way we could get these perfectly lined up just by measuring and guessing. Okay, so that is stuck down there. Do the second. very, very hot, and this epoxy is hardening quickly, which is why I'm being more quick than obsessive. If this was 3-hour cure time epoxy on a cold day, I would make sure I very carefully buttered the entire surface on both sides. But this is 5-minute epoxy on a very hot day. Here we go. Lock it in place, give it a wiggle. And even with imperfect surface buttering, that will be very, very stuck down. Far more than we need. Now, the last thing that we need here is we need a way to get metal in and to both pieces. So I cut this little gate, and it's just kind of whittled out of one of these cutoff blocks. The sides all have draft all the way around, and I gave it a good sanding and rounded all of these curves. So that goes in nicely right about there and touches them. So this is going to get a little epoxy as well. I'm running out of epoxy, but it's just going to have to do. This piece is not that critical. It has to be there. It has to touch the other pieces. But it doesn't, other than being present and touching the other pieces, there's no, you can see it's hardening on me, absolute alignment that it absolutely must have. So if my hurriedness with this batch of epoxy bites me in the butt on this, wrong way, no big deal. I'll just glue it down again. Okay? So there's that piece. So there's our gate to get metal into these pieces. Now, when I sanded this and sanded draft into it, one of the consequences of that is it doesn't make great contact with the two side pieces. So I'm going to come in and grab a little wood putty and smear a little wood putty in there. And then I'll sand that down. I'm just going to smear it in all ugly like. And we'll sand it down, and that will make a nice connection between the gate and the work. Okay? So there's the assembly of the board. Last couple of things that we'll be doing on this, and I'm going to do all of this off camera, is right there, that's going to be the sprue, that round mark. I'm just going to drill a 3/4 inch hole down through it. The sprue will be then in good contact with the gate going in both directions. And this will extend up. So this is going to be the cope, since this is where the sprue will be. Okay? And then this side there will be the drag. Okay? So the sprue, I'll just drill about 1 inch deep or so here. I won't go all the way through the plywood, but I'll drill about 1 inch deep, and just shy of 1 inch deep, 7/8. And then the sprue will just stick in here when I pack sand, and that will be, the funnel through which the lead pours in, spreads out along this gate to the pieces. And in this particular thing, that sprue should have plenty of metal in it that it will be the riser, and I won't need an extra riser. And if there's a little shrinkage on a duck weight, so what? It's a duck weight, okay? So this isn't something where I have to be real obsessive over dimension, okay? So you can get away with a little bit more that way. So that's this piece. I'll get those things done. I'll get this in. I'll get it all sanded off nice. I'll get it all cleaned up. I'll get that drilled out. And then I'm going to take these scraps and cut them and make some alignment brackets around the edge to hold the flask in its proper orientation. Those will sit directly on the lines that I've already drawn on this side, like right there. And then I'll transfer these lines around with a square and have that on the other side. So those will be alignment blocks so that the cope and the drag don't shimmy scooch out of where I want them to when I'm actually using the thing. So that is a fully assembled match plate. So here we go. We've got some weights. I've got a big one for these screw-on decoy weights. And I threw this on a scale and did a little bit of density conversions from average density of cherry to density of lead. And that would, this if cast in lead would be a little over a ½ pound or so. These weigh about half as much as the big one, and the little one weighs about half as much as the medium one. So we've got some size options. We have our match plate here fully prepared. I've sprayed everything just with some cheap hardware store gloss green. Formal foundries have like formal color associations with this color painted on the pattern here. It means it plays this role in the mold, and that's important when you get up to that level with a lot more going on than these couple of simple patterns. But I like green and it was handy, so they're green. If you think green's the wrong color, tough. Watch a different channel. Anyway, I did spray the whole plywood green. This wouldn't necessarily need to be done, but since I'm going to be using green sand and, hey, more green. Anyway, since I'm going to be using green sand and that contains water, I don't want my plywood to barrel. So I just spritz the surface a little bit with the spray paint just to give it a little water resistance so that it's less likely to barrel out and warp on me, you know, if it gets a little bit of moisture on it. I did drill the 3/4 inch hole for the sprue for mounting this, and I think this came out quite nice. So there's the cope side, and there's the drag side. Okay, so we have our 2-part swing weight pattern. Now, if you're enjoying this and want to keep seeing some other takes on pattern making, we're going to be doing the angle corners for campaign style furniture, and we're going to be doing a holding block for the miniature duck decoy paperweights, and that will be the next video. So if you've enjoyed this, I would be most grateful if you gave it a thumbs up and help the YouTube algorithm know that you enjoyed it so that it can show it to other folks. I'm always very grateful when you do that. And I hope that you'll join us here next time for more pattern making at Old Ways Rising Farm.